Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Fast Times News Podcast. We'd love to take those headlines that seem like just another day in the news cycle and really break them open. And that's what we're doing today. We're diving deep into U.S. and Colombian relations, specifically around deportation policies. And it might sound kind of dry, but trust me, this one gets juicy. It's a story about immigration, of course, but also about economics, international power plays. You'll see how it all connects. To get into all of this, we've got some great research lined up. We've got analyses of U.S. immigration policies under Trump and how they specifically impacted Colombia. We'll also be looking at the effects on trade, the whole idea of national sovereignty and what it means for the future of Latin America. So yeah, get ready because this deep dive is going to take us from a single deportation flight to some really big questions about how the world works.
Absolutely. And I think one of the most striking things that jumps out when you first look at this story is the imagery. You've got the U.S. using military planes to deport people back to Colombia under the Trump administration. It's a powerful image, right? It's not subtle at all.
Military planes for deportations. Yeah, that definitely sends a message. What do you think was the thinking behind that? Was it really the most practical approach, or was there something else going on?
Well, on the surface, it was presented as a way to project strength, show that the administration was serious about immigration control, zero tolerance, and all that. But I think it's impossible to ignore the optics of it. The message it sent not just to Colombia, but to the entire region.
You're saying it was more about the show of force than actual effectiveness?
I think that's a big part of it. It was a very public display of power. And that raises some interesting questions for us to consider. Was it really effective policy? Or was it more about symbolism? Critics at the time definitely pointed out that it was dehumanizing using military force in a situation like this. And there were concerns about the potential damage to U.S. relations with Colombia and Latin America more broadly.
So how did Colombia respond to all this? They didn't just roll over, did they?
Oh, not at all. President Petro actually initially refused to accept the deportees. He argued that it was inhumane and a violation of Colombia's sovereignty.
Wow, that's a pretty bold move, taking on the U.S. like that.
It was. It really resonated with people because it tapped into this wider frustration with U.S. policies in the region.
Yeah, this idea that the U.S. often throws its weight around without fully considering the consequences for others.
Right. It was like this David and Goliath situation unfolding. And as you can imagine, Goliath wasn't too happy about being challenged.
So what did the U.S. do? I'm guessing they didn't just back down.
Nope. Instead, they hit back with a classic power move. They threatened to impose massive tariffs on Colombian goods, up to 50%.
50%, that's huge.
Yeah.
Think about what that would do to the prices of things Americans buy every day. Coffee flowers. All of a sudden, they'd be way more expensive. So Colombia's stuck between a rock and a hard place, right? They want to stand up for their principles, but their economy's on the line.
Exactly. They were in a really tough spot.
What would you have done in their situation?
Honestly, it's a lose-lose. In the end, Colombia had to back down. The economic pressure was just too much. The U.S. is their biggest trading partner, and those tariffs have been devastating.
It really highlights how interconnected economics and politics are, especially on the global stage.
Absolutely. This wasn't just some abstract policy debate. It had real-world consequences for people on both sides, and it had a ripple effect throughout Latin America. Other countries were watching this whole thing unfold very closely.
And that's where things start to get even more interesting, right? It becomes about more than just this one incident with the deportation flight.
Exactly. The incident with Colombia was a wake-up call for a lot of countries in the region. They saw how vulnerable they were to U.S. economic pressure, and it fueled a movement to become less reliant on the U.S.
So they started looking for ways to diversify their economies, reduce that dependence.
Exactly. Some countries turned towards China, others strengthened ties with the European Union. It was a direct response to this realization that relying too heavily on the U.S. could come back to bite them.
It's like a chain reaction, right? One event triggers all these other things you wouldn't necessarily expect.
Yeah. Exactly. It shows how these issues can have unintended consequences, especially on a global scale. And it wasn't just playing out in Latin America either.
Oh, right. What was happening back in the U.S. while all this was going on?
Well, you can imagine this kind of hardline approach to immigration wasn't exactly universally popular.
Yeah, there had to be some pushback domestically, too.
Right. Absolutely. It sparked a lot of debate within the U.S. about how to balance domestic priorities with America's role as a global leader.
So what were the main arguments on each side?
Well, Trump's approach definitely appealed to a segment of his base. For them, it was about cracking down on illegal immigration, putting American jobs and security first.
Right, America first.
Exactly. They saw it as a sign of strength, a commitment to putting America's interests first.
But I imagine others were concerned about the impact on America's global image.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That was a major concern for a lot of people. Foreign policy experts, diplomats, they argued that this kind of aggressive approach could damage America's reputation as a defender of human rights and a reliable partner on the world stage.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. It's like you're trying to assert your power, but it could end up pushing other countries away.
Exactly. And it raised concerns about whether it would ultimately push countries towards America's rivals.
So it's a real balancing act, isn't it? Trying to address domestic concerns while also maintaining your standing as a global leader.
It is. And it's something that every administration struggles with. This situation with Colombia just brought those tensions into really sharp focus.
Yeah, you can really see how those two things are constantly pulling against each other.
It also forced people to think about the costs and benefits of using economic leverage as a political tool.
Right, like with those tariffs,
Yeah.
it's a powerful weapon, but it can have a lot of unintended consequences.
Exactly. So let's fast forward a bit. What happened after all the dust settled with Colombia? Did anything really change? Did the U.S. stick with this aggressive approach? And did Latin America actually manage to become less dependent on the U.S.? Well, like with most things in international relations, the answer isn't so simple.
Right, nothing's ever black and white.
It's a complex web of actions and reactions, and the ripple effects of this whole situation are still being felt today.
Okay, so break it down for us. What were some of the long-term consequences of this whole ordeal?
Well, on the U.S. side, the use of tariffs as a negotiating tactic continued to be a big part of the Trump administration's foreign policy.
So they doubled down on that approach.
Pretty much. It created a lot of uncertainty in global markets, and it definitely strained relationships with traditional allies, not just in Latin America either.
But did it achieve its goals? Did it actually force countries to fall in line with U.S. demands?
It's hard to say for sure. In some cases, yeah, it did lead to concessions. Countries would make changes to their policies to avoid those tariffs. But in the long run, I think it also created a lot of resentment.
Like they were being bullied into submission.
Exactly. It fueled this desire to find ways to work around the U.S. to reduce its influence. So in a way, it might have actually backfired.
Interesting. So for Latin America, did they actually make any progress towards diversifying their economies? Did they manage to get out from under the thumb of the U.S. economy?
To a certain extent, yes. There was definitely a noticeable shift towards strengthening regional trade agreements within Latin America.
Oh, so they started working more closely with each other.
Right, exactly. They started boosting their own economies and relying less on the U.S. And as we talked about earlier, they also explored new partnerships with countries like China, looking for alternatives to the U.S.
So in a way, Trump's policies might have actually pushed Latin America towards greater independence.
It's possible. It's a classic case of unintended consequences. By trying to assert dominance and force these countries into submission, the U.S. might have actually sped up the process of them finding their own way on the global stage.
Wow. It's like that old saying, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Right. It's a good reminder that power dynamics are always in flux. Even the most powerful players can't always predict or control the outcomes.
So where does all of this leave us today? This all happened under the Trump administration. But are we seeing similar patterns now?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? I mean, have things really changed? Are we handling these kinds of situations any differently now?
It really makes you think, like what have we learned from all of this?
It's something to keep in mind as you're following the news and seeing these kinds of stories play out. You know, it's easy to get caught up in the day-to-day, but it's important to step back sometimes. Look at the bigger picture.
Exactly. Like all those connections we've been talking about.
Right.
Seeing how these things fit into larger trends and patterns.
Right. And also remembering that it's not just about politics or economics, it's about people. Real people's lives are affected by these decisions.
That's a good point. It's easy to forget that sometimes when you're talking about things on a global scale.
Yeah, it can feel very abstract. But those decisions made by governments, by people in power, they have real consequences for individuals all over the world.
So what can we do about it? As individuals, I mean.
I think the most important thing is to stay informed. Ask questions. Hold our leaders accountable. We all have a role to play in shaping a more just and equitable world.
Well said. Couldn't agree more. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. Really appreciate you taking the time to break all of this down for us.
It's been my pleasure. These are important conversations to have.
Absolutely. And to all our listeners out there, we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on this? Do you think the U.S. has learned from this experience? Is Latin America really on the path to greater independence? Let us know in the comments.
Yeah, keep the conversation going. Don't stop learning and questioning.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So that wraps up our deep dive into U.S.-Colombia relations. We hope this has given you some new insights into global politics, economics, and all those complex dynamics at play. Thanks for joining us on the Fast Times News Podcast. We'll catch you next time.